everyone, my name is PINK, and I bid you welcome to part 3. Alright. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. The last section of the 1941 DLC of Panzer 2 is where your trusted assistant, Hauptmann Stefan Wagner, gets himself into an ambush and dies. Here, I've said it. And obviously the nerd turd Gerhard is replacing him and turns out to be a reasonably decent officer, but I'll certainly miss Hauptmann Wagner a lot, especially since we don't know if he's dead. Let me put on my German-engineered aluminium foil helmet first.
And say that we really don't know about his fate, man. All that Lieutenant Gerhard says is,
we have retrieved Stefan's body, but the medics do not think he's going to make it. Because that's Lieutenant's actual voice. So we really don't know what the actual fate of Wagner's is. And I'm kind of prepared to accept both possible outcomes. On the one hand, this is war. And this is war on the Soviet-German front. And proportionally, you were more likely to die as an officer than just as a soldier. That certainly was true for the German army. And certainly at the end of the DLC, we hear from Kapitan Anna and her and Wagner's baby. And I'm happy to say that these characters are fleshed out enough, even for a bastard as cold-hearted as me, to care about them. And their stories, but I still wouldn't mind if Wagner returned in 1942 with an eye patch and a wooden leg and a parrot on his shoulder. In any case, I really hope that this change is not some sort of a play it safe move where there will be no more interesting characters and Gerhard will effectively turn into the boring old mustachioed general of the main campaign. That'd be sad. What didn't make me sad are the actual missions in this DLC. The combination of the Balkans and the Barbarossa campaign offers a bounty of different environments and opponents, from the largely infantry-based Greeks and Yugoslavians giving you hell in the mountains, through the well-equipped British, and to the desperate armored waves of the Red Army. And speaking of Barbarossa, I enjoy the largely historical narrative that the missions there build, because by the beginning of the scenarios we're going to talk about today, the game becomes awfully easy, and this includes the first 3 missions which lead to the encirclement of Kiev. You just move and move and move and move, and the Soviets can't offer anything against you, especially in the air. And I was going to complain about it until I played the last 4 missions. What happened? Well, exactly what happened in real life. The Germans achieved huge successes and air supremacy where they needed it, but then autumn came and the combination of overambitious advances and overextended supply lines and terrible weather they were not prepared for. All of this gave the Red Army the time to resupply, regroup, reinforce. And this is exactly what we see in the mud, the absence of air support, the relentless Soviet counterattacks of the last 4 missions. For all the ability to custom build your own Rudel and the sometimes silly special units like the Heinkel 111Z, it was these last 4 missions that propelled my opinion about this DLC from quite good to actually brilliant. The ability to plop your own airfields also helped, obviously. And before I get to the mission guides, let me just express one criticism. A commenter recently asked me why I didn't include any information about the commendation points you could get and spend, and the things you could spend them on. And the reason here is that I don't see the need for that. If you play your cards right and fulfill all of the secondary objectives, the game is profusely generous with all of the commendation points. And so whenever it asks you, would you like to spend some commendation points on this and that, you can always say yes because you have too much already. Let's not forget that a game is a series of interesting choices, and I really don't see any choices in here, and there is no game in trying to manage this resource, commendation points. We need it to be scarce no matter how good you are, so that the choices and the decisions you make in spending commendation points actually make sense and are interesting and engaging. I think the number of commendation points could depend on the difficulty level you are playing at, so that the less experienced and more casual players can experience some of the interesting content and goodies too. In any case, I'd really like to see something done about this in 1942. And now, on to the missions. The Gomel scenario is where Panzer Corps 2 gets as close to a narrative exposition story mission as a World War II wargame can. It's easily the simplest mission of the entire DLC, I think including Zagreb, and it's only here to introduce the potential death of Hauptmann Wagner. The battle itself doesn't present any surprises. Unless you're interested in taking all of the flags, don't bother about the eastern parts of the map at all, and just follow the railway, smashing the weakly defended strongpoints until you reach the city of Gomel itself. Once your artillery gets in range, it shouldn't take more than a couple of turns to take over the city. There will be a very feeble counterattack from the other side of the river, which can be easily stopped by just blocking the bridges, and you might also expect a couple of enemy units to come from Vietka, so covering the flank there is a reasonably good idea. The Lokhvitsa mission is very much in the mood of Barbarossa, walk in the park kind of mood that we've been having lately. However, unlike Gomel, the Soviets have pretty strong counterattacks in store here for you, and they will have a bunch of very strong units, including those you have to destroy as part of your objectives, i.e. the generals. So let's go and hunt them first. Our initial destination will be the hill north of Priluki. It houses what I think the most annoying of the four generals, the big overstrength artillery gun. It is covered by AA guns, and it is no slouch in direct ground combat. Having a unit with a lightning-attacked hero, like that Rudel guy we've all been hearing about, would be incredibly useful here. Once the RT is dead, advance towards Priluki. Make sure not to get too cocky in here. Crossing the imaginary line between Priluki and Romny will trigger a Soviet counterattack strong enough to pick off stray units. So once Priluki is yours, regroup and advance towards Romny in good order. Once all of the generals are dead and both the towns you need to take are taken, it's a no-brainer. The first Panzer group is very competent and should hang around Lokhvitsa by the time you're done with your business. The only potential hazard here is the fact that there is a defensive line between Lokhvitsa and the hill west of it. Don't get into traps there, and keep in mind that you only have to contact the first Panzer group to win the mission. Alright, in 1941, Kiev was the place of a big encirclement in real life. It was the location of a huge encirclement in Panzer Corps 2 original campaign. And hey, we see Kiev 1941 in this DLC. What is it about? Is the huge encirclement again? Yes, it is, and the trick here is how to set up that encirclement with as little hassle as possible. Tip number 1, see that crescent-shaped line of objectives? Don't even think about taking them all right away, and you really don't need them for the encirclement to work. Tip number 2, once you take the objectives between Nizhyn and Zhirivka, take a little break and weather the massive Soviet counterattack from the west. This is pretty much as hard as this mission is going to get. Once that attack runs out of steam, there will be no one between you and Kiev, and you can comfortably do what you're supposed to. Tip number 3, Panzer Group 1 is still very competent. You can rely on it taking and blocking the river crossing in Zhirivka and south of it. Tip 4, you've got too many tractors. Use them to set up your encirclement. Just plop them every 2 hexes in a straight line from river to river, and from there on, the only thing you need to do is to starve and destroy the defenders of Kiev proper, and then just raid the forest in the north and take the remaining objectives. It's a very difficult terrain to fight in, so it's better to leave those objectives for last when you don't have anything else left to do. Remember back in the day, last week that I told you to go for the bottom in the earlier Barbarossa missions? Well, now we're in Bryansk and the shit is about to hit the fan, so let's get used to going through the top from now on. But first, throw out your planes and don't expect them to return very soon. The airfields are poorly positioned and the weather will be terrible throughout the mission. Plus, the Soviets will not have any planes of their own. To compensate for the lack of air support, bring as many artillery pieces as you can. A bunch of long-range guns would be a great idea here. If you look at the map, it's pretty obvious that the river will be the biggest obstacle in this mission. The Soviets have done a great job covering the crossings at Bryansk and Trubchevsk, but in the north it's virtually undefended, and the hills on the eastern bank of the river there make for an excellent counter-battery position for your long-ranged artillery. So obviously that's where you'll send most of your artillery to, and a few tanks and infantry units as support and as the main force that will take over Bryansk from the north. The second half of your troops should comprise mostly tanks, tank destroyers, maybe a Warfram 40, and a little bit of infantry. These guys should go straight south to take over Potsep and then pivot east towards Bryansk. Once you clear Potsep, I highly recommend you to leave an infantry unit there. There are a bunch of Soviet units roaming about in that sea of mud next to Potsep. You really don't have the time or the mobility to catch all of them, and they'll happily take the village back. Otherwise, advance towards the east, making sure that you time your approach to Bryansk to your northern assault. Also expect a big Soviet armored counterattack once you reach the last village west of Bryansk. Don't rush it, the Soviets have enough forces there to destroy even the strongest of your units one by one, so wait for your AT guns to arrive and turn that village into a strong point with a good infantry unit. By this point, your long-ranged artillery in the north might be well positioned already to provide support against these Soviet tanks. Remember, hills are your best friends here. Once you grind through those tanks, advance towards Bryansk and clear it, send a few units, including a Wolframen, to capture Trubchevsk, and then carefully advance into that last objective south of Bryansk. This is a well-fortified Soviet line we're looking at here, and even if attacked from behind, it can get you into trouble. Finally, you can expect a stray Soviet unit or two coming from the spawn zone in the northeast, so make sure you have someone to cover Bryansk from that direction. And yes, it's that Kalashnikov. Mozhaisk Line is what I would call a one-trick mission. The Soviets will hate you for learning this easy trick. See that little road north of your positions? That's your key to dealing with the 4 objectives in the north. A couple of tanks and artillery units and an infantry will be sufficient to handle these objectives and to stop that little Soviet force trying to reinforce Gorobeiniki. The rest of your forces, and let me remind you that your corps shouldn't change from Bryansk. The weather is still terrible for planes, so bring as much artillery as you can and still bring your AT guns. Because once you crack that first defensive line, just go through it, it's not that difficult. The Soviets will counterattack with overstrength KV-1 units, among other tanks. Bring out your Sturmel and your long-ranged artillery and wipe all of those tanks out. From there on, it's a reasonably smooth ride. Maloyaroslavets is not well defended, although I recommend doing a little pincer maneuver and attack Kaluga from the east. That little ridge northwest of it is infested with Soviet AT guns and artillery with camouflage heroes. They'll just sit there invisible until you get too close for safety. It feels like Maskirovka is becoming a big thing with the Soviets. Every DLC of Panzer Corps 2 so far has had a big climactic battle somewhere in it. For 1941, obviously it's the Battle of Moscow. Actually, it's the game's second take on the battle, and this version is so much better at conveying the fact that the Germans were on their last legs as they were approaching the city. So let's keep that in mind and look at our situation. 1, you don't have to take the entire map. All that you need is 2 objectives in addition to what you've already got, and the Kremlin. And this is where you realize that attacking the city from the north is a really good idea. There are 2 objectives in the immediate vicinity, and the Kremlin is just a couple of really well-defended hexes away. However, there's one little problem. While the Germans are on their last legs, the Soviets are not. In addition to the defending red faction on the map, the Soviets have an armored and aggressive blue faction that represents the Red Army counterattack in the area. They will attack right off the bat, so don't rush towards Moscow. Split your forces between Volokholamsk and Malyaroslavetsk crossing and set up defensive perimeters to destroy the Soviet attackers, which will be particularly strong in the middle. With Volokholamsk, you can start counterattacking around turn 3. The southern crossing is less important, but make sure you keep a couple of units there to block any Soviet troops that try to probe into that area. Once you're done with the Soviet attack, move your troops east. The direction of these attacks should converge at the objective northwest of the Kremlin. You will not see much resistance before you reach the city itself, but this is where you'll face the most annoying part of this mission. The Soviet Air Force coming out of nowhere. It's incredibly strong, but the weather is too bad for you to bring a full-sized Air Force here. You have to compromise, and my choice was to bring 2 mobile AA guns. Smaller caliber rapid-fire guns are better, because the Soviets will only bring fighters and close air support planes, and bring 1 fighter of your own, as experienced and as pimped out with heroes as possible. Don't expect any semblance of air supremacy here, but keeping damage to your ground troops to a minimum is already a good achievement, because there'll be plenty of ways for them to get damaged on the ground. As you start assaulting the city, the Soviets will throw everything into it, in addition to the already strong network of artillery and AT guns there. So my suggestion here is to be very methodical. Get all of your artillery in range. Any kinds of grand Guderian-esque maneuvers here will be punished with the loss of core units, so cover your flanks with armor and bring your top infantry with cover into the city. Good luck. I think the Klin mission is a really nice way to round off this entire DLC. It's a bit of a change of pace, and this time we're not attacking. We're running away. The Soviets have a huge numerical advantage here, including in the air, but thankfully the weather is good now and we can devote quite a lot of core slots to our fighters. No bombers yet. The summer is over. Nevertheless, we'll need fighter supports, and the first thing that you should get out of the way is taking the airfield conveniently placed between Staritsa and Klin. Power dropping a few Fallschirmjäger there on turn 1 would be a great idea. Don't bother trying to defend Klin, it's a suicide, and you can leave Rzhev undefended because it's kinda difficult to make a stand there, and even though the Soviets will take it, smoking them out of it will not be a difficult task. The actual difficult task is getting those trucks and lorries out of Klin, which should drive as quickly as possible towards the forest around the deployment point between Volokholamsk and Klin. You can set up a strong point there with tanks and AT guns, just in case. I found that if you're fast enough with the trucks, the Soviets will not pursue. And once the trucks are deep in the forest, you can just leave them there, they're safe. At this point, you can get your paratroopers back into transport planes, drop them in Rzhev, and destroy whatever defenders the Soviets have left there. Of course, you'll have to survive until the end of the mission, and the Soviets will send a huge wave of tanks towards Volokholamsk and through it. So my approach is to get that screening force of AT guns and tanks across the marshes and into the west, eventually meeting the advancing Soviet troops at the village west of Volokholamsk. Don't rush it, make sure you come in force and don't leave the Soviets any easy targets. They're strong enough to exploit your mistakes. In any case, once that attack runs out of steam, you'll just have to wait for the mission to end, because from this point, controlling the western part of the map is not that difficult. And this is it for 1941. The Balkans subjugated, and Barbarossa gloriously fought and failed. Let's see what the future brings. I really hope this is not the last time we hear of Hauptmann Wagner, Kapitan Anna, and their little daughter. Cheers.